What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Layback Podcast. Joining us today is now Layback Podcast veteran Josh Hejka. He formally joined us for an interview a good while ago, back when he was a Mets minor leaguer. Now he is a free agent, which all of you will hear on what will be his second appearance. It hasn't come out yet at the time of this recording, but prior to us releasing this episode, you will have seen our actual panel presentation from Wake Forest. That might not be the cleanest episode ever released, but you get to see what we actually talked about at the Wake Forest Player Development Seminar, which brings us to the actual content for today's episode. Josh was gracious enough to join us in Winston-Salem to be on that panel, which we'll go into a little bit of detail on. But because of that, and because Josh is a diligent note taker and learner himself, I figured there was no one better, aside from maybe Tim Campos and Josh Epstein, to join us on a review. Last year, Gavin Kipstroud and I went through a full review of every single presentation. Unfortunately, Gavin was unable to attend the seminar this year, so we have Josh kind of serving his normal role, mop-up duty, picking up the pieces for everyone. So Josh, hopefully this isn't too foreign of a position for you, and thanks for making the time to hop on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. It was a great opportunity to speak on the panel. Really appreciate you having me out. I will apologize to any viewers who may encounter audio issues on that panel because I did accidentally turn off the microphone at one point. Adam luckily figured that out and turned the microphone back on, but maybe we'll be able to redub some of my audio in the in post, and you won't even realize that the audio issues existed. But I'm excited to talk Wake Forest pitching, a player development seminar. Sorry.
Yeah, and I guess that's a good catch because now it was once again a true player development seminar instead of just pitching, which I know this was your first year, but kind of in the past couple of years, it's been very, very pitcher focused. So I was glad to see some hitting stuff make it back in. To address your point about audio issues, don't worry because I don't think the mics actually even worked for any of us. Is now just a funny little prop, I guess all of us were holding with those mini mics in front of our faces.
It looks professional.
Yeah, we're just dealing with iPad audio from across the room. And hey, I already produced it because I was like, hey, it's too far gone. There's nothing I'm going to do to save this. And you can hear what we're saying. Maybe there's the occasional mumble, but yeah, we get through it. But we got a lot of presentations to get through, so I guess we might as well dive right in. And kicking off the player development seminar for 2025 was the Wake Forest coaching staff. The Wake Forest coaching staff, I generally love their presentations year to year. I think they do a great job. Normally, what we expect from them is case studies on their individual players. Now, what changed this year is a completely new coaching staff. So we heard from Eric Neeson and Ezra Bai instead of Corey Muscara, and then whoever assisted him in the process. Normally, it's Chris Lewis or Sean Fisher. Chris took a back seat this year since he's entering into a role with the Phillies, but Ezra and Neese took over. So Josh, since you are the esteemed guest, I will even pass it off to you for initial thoughts.
Yeah, so I thought this was great stuff. For those who don't know, I work, even when I'm not playing, I work in research and development with Driveline. And so this is a lot of stuff that we also try to implement here at Driveline, just understanding the role of biomechanics in developing players. And for me, it boils down to a couple main things. One is obviously it's like a checkpoint in time, like fully understanding like where you stand. And then for example, if you gain a bunch of velo or you lose a bunch of velo or you gain command or lose command, you can look back at previous checkpoints in time and see what's changed. I really enjoy how Wake Forest discussed this process that they use. There are a couple big things that stuck out to me. One is this idea of these intra-athlete trends over the course of the season. And they could basically figure out for a certain guy what particular biomechanical element is most important to his success. I think they gave an example of one guy, it might have been lateral trunk flexion or something along those lines, or trunk flexion angle, something like that. And they noticed that as this was changing over the course of the season, his performance was suffering, his velo went down. And so they're able to target a specific intervention to get him back on track. There were a couple other things I thought were really interesting. One is that they primarily used velocity as their predictor variable for the biomechanics reports. But they also talked about the role of arm slot. And I thought this was very interesting where maybe if you pursue a change that would actually gain you velocity, it might lead to a change in your arm slot that or some other variable in the kinetic chain that would actually decrease your performance on the field. I think a perfect example of this, they didn't talk about this, but just making connections is to myself, right? So like I'm a submarine pitcher. If I purely optimize for velocity, I would probably raise my slot drastically, but that would likely lead to a decrease in my effectiveness as a pitcher because I would now be with less unique shapes, less unique release angle. And so it's just really important to keep the main thing, which is like getting outs on the field. And so that's obviously something where if you have an individual relationship with your players, you'll know like what makes them successful, what makes them like what their strengths are as a pitcher, and not losing that in the process of optimizing your biomechanics.
Instead of just responding to the stuff that you said, I'm going to add on with a couple of things that stood out to me. Big point, and I think you and I probably could have intuitively gotten to this point, but it was great to see it on paper that Ezra mapped out that throwing programs take up about 70% of throwing volume, especially for their group of guys, their college athletes. So sides, lives, and games or more competitive throwing makes up that other 30%. If that's the case, where are we actually going to spend our time developing and how can we make adjustments in the process? I thought that was awesome to bring to light, knowing that the game is actually played on the mound. So if that's the case, why are we spending so much time, which is our greatest resource, in an area that, yes, we can build throwing fitness, stealing a word from Casey Mulholland there, in the throwing program, or we can prep to get to that more competition style throwing. But it really isn't increasing our output potential for anything other than endurance, which, I mean, there's so many other things. So I was glad to see that come to light and I guess understand how Ezra on the development side and then Neeson on the execution side are able to apply those principles. Then not just the discussion surrounding utilizing velocity, not only on the performance side, but also in these throwing progressions was stressed so heavily by the Wake Forest group. Yes, you and I are very familiar with the importance of objective data in not just an on-ramp or a rehab, but in managing overall throwing workload and seeing how Wake Forest is able to utilize velocity and how important it is in their program, not just for performance, but truly for managing daily outputs. A couple other points that I wrote down. Ezra, I thought, told a great story specifically about his jazz music example with Miles Davis and Herbie Hancock. And the way that I internalized that was kind of the environmental constraints, utilizing, I guess, discovery in a sense, or a different throwing implement, such as a plyo ball or different surfaces that you might throw on, giving the body or giving the individual different problems to solve. You are never encountering, or you are less likely to encounter something that is going to impose a challenge. I think this probably even goes back to something that you talk about time and time again, which would be Bernstein's hammer.
Yep. And so I think the fundamental, for those who don't know, Bernstein's hammer is a study from probably 50, 60 plus years ago. Bernstein was looking at this master blacksmith, and the thought at the time was that, and even this is still a thought that resonates with a lot of coaches nowadays, is that repeatable mechanics are better. It's important to break down performance into two different things. One is outputs, and one is the movement that generates the output. We want repeatable outputs, right? We want to be able to consistently throw the ball where we want. We want to be able to throw it as hard as we can. We want to be able to, throw it with the shape that we always throw it with. But the mechanics that get us there are not necessarily going to be repeatable. And in fact, they're very much not going to be repeatable. The study found that the master blacksmith was very, very good at hitting the nail on the head, obviously. But because of the way that the hammer deflected off the nail each time, there was some variability. And so he couldn't just use the exact same swing of his arm every single time to hit the nail. He had to be able to make these micro adjustments and adjust for that variability in order to hit the nail on the head. I think the analogy that I always go back to, some of the guys here at Driveline go back to, is this idea of you don't want to memorize or rehearse a solution. You want to be able to understand the underlying, the fundamental function that allows you to generate a solution. So if I just memorize 9 times 7, 63, right, Adam?
Yep.
If it's 63,
good callback.
Okay, great. If I ever see that math problem pop up on a test, that's great. But if I don't know how to do multiplication, if I ever see a problem that's not 9 times 7, I'm going to be screwed. And so the same thing with moving. There's so many different like variations, whether it's in temperature, whether it's the way the mound is that day, the weather, all these little things affect how the movement solution required in order to have what I just said as like a consistent output, that we have to be able to make these little adjustments, even pitch to pitch, like my fatigue level is different. Boiling down to it at the end of the day, it's like, it's being able to like not just memorize a certain solution, but being able to approach a new problem and find a solution that works. That's what actually represents skill and mastery over a certain topic.
And maybe to kind of round out this, unless we want to keep hammering away at it, sorry to use hammer there, but it only seemed natural. There are another couple pieces that I enjoyed hearing. We began to understand what's actually important to the coaching staff and how they make decisions. One of which was continually stressed, and that was chasing faster feedback loops. Wake Forest is very much a data-driven player development system. They have the lab. They have 20 plus student analysts that can support what they do, which is amazing. I understand not everybody is going to have that. Professional organizations that don't have as much manpower to create that type of high-level decision-making. But what Wake Forest has done is identified, one, their competitive advantage and their identity by having that information. Because, yeah, it's great to have information. It's great to have data. But what they can now do is weaponize that by turning it over quickly and putting it in the hands of people that can make decisions. They can all speak the same language. Not every player needs to have the same aptitude for the data. And to be fair, not every coach does either. I know I'm kind of getting into some of our discussion. I guess I'm foreshadowing a tad, but knowing how important that feedback loop is for Wake Forest, and then they specifically highlighted collaboration, autonomy, and then ultimately autonomy being ranked higher than dependency. That's kind of how they looked at it. They want to create this system where players can collaborate with the coach to learn what they need to do, so then they can do it on their own. Not have to say, hey, coach, look at me, I'm doing my drill, but giving them the tools to do what they need. And then the coach can go back and look at the output. So whether it's the velocity, whether it's the TrackMan plot, whether it's edger video, biomechanical assessments, FlexPro numbers, shoulder dynamometry, anything. So then they can go back and make the decision necessary to put the player in the best spot possible.
Yep. And I think that's an important feedback loop that like you want to have as a player in season too. Like you want to be able, you don't want to have to like wait till you go in the dugout between innings for your coach to tell you what you did wrong. Like you want to be able to like recognize that in yourself and have this really, really tight feedback loop so you can make adjustments on the fly. It's a concept in motor learning known as like KR, knowledge of results. And especially for elite athletes, elite performers, that quicker feedback loop is correlated with a higher learning effect and higher performance. So it makes complete sense.
And my final piece with the Wake Forest group is one word that they used a few times, and that was the nudge. I don't know if they created the phrase the nudge. I can only assume they did not, and they brought it in from somewhere. But the nudge was the way that pitching coach Eric Neeson talked about, I guess, going from that moment of gaining trust with a player to pushing them towards a decision that the staff might want them to make, or a suggestion that they feel best suits the player in the long run. And part of the reason I'm calling that out, one, I always like hearing the languages that get created for these different cultures. Obviously, each team is going to have its own culture. I like those kind of sociological dynamics and understanding the communication style, but that really kind of alludes to the conversation that we later had on Saturday morning. And you can't really force people to do anything at this point. You can encourage it, but even the point of encouragement is going to require a baseline level of trust or a mutual understanding of the ultimate objectives.
And sometimes those tight feedback loops allows you to build that trust very rapidly, because
Yes.
if you can show a player that he's going to get better if he buys into your system, like he's going to be more willing to continue buying into your system rather than like, all right, like trust me for the next 6 months. And like,
Yes.
it's like, how am I supposed to really know that I'm like actually getting better? This boils down back to the test retest cycle, which I'm a big believer in. You test something, you make a plan for improving it, you retest. Did it improve it? Yes. Okay, great. Should we keep doing that? Maybe, maybe not. Did it improve it? No. Okay, let's try something else. But it's you can't really get anywhere without that feedback and a plan of attack.
That's an excellent point, because maybe from the way I phrased it, the nudge sounds like it has to be an arm around the shoulder in a conversation in relationship building, which, yes, it can be. But when you have data, or in this Wake Forest instance, where you have a tighter feedback loop and you're weaponizing the data or you're using it to create a development plan, that can be a nudge. If
No
I
doubt.
can look at a stuff plus model, or I can pull up pitch plots or results on sinkers thrown at 92 miles per hour to offhanded hitters and show you that those get slugged like crazy. Maybe not for other people, but for you, they did. That's all the nudge you need, right? Like, because
No
you
doubt.
don't want to perform badly. It doesn't take much. You don't need a coach to then create this crazy relationship, because the numbers don't lie. Like, you can't fudge that data if you got slugged, I don't know, 700 against on
Did you see my stats from last year or something?
I don't know. Well, what they actually gave the example of was Blake Morningstar's two seam against lefties, which he did not have a single swing and miss on the
Mm,
entire 2025 season for.
no comment.
Yeah, yeah. So,
That sounds like me.
which is why you were developing something new and lowering the arm slot again.
But yeah, overall, love this presentation.
Yeah, 5 out of 5, right? Or whatever system that's a rookie score. So I don't know. We're not going to score every one, but I don't know, 8.6 out of 10.
I'll defer to your
Sure.
judgment.
Yeah, these are all theoretical scores. We're going to change the scale after every presentation. Maybe that's what we're going to
Perfect.
do. We're going to require some sort of assessment piece where we make up. But first one, 8.6 out of 10. Also, I did like their theme of data to coach to dirt. I'm not going to
Agreed.
spend a lot of time on that, but I just thought that was a good presentation theme with every
Agreed.
single thing they produced. They first talked about the data, then they talked about how they coached it, and then they talked about how they applied it, which was the
On the
dirt
field.
or the competition. So
Yep.
now moving on, which, if I'm not mistaken, was labeled your favorite presentation from the weekend.
One of my
And
favorites for sure.
yeah, so one of, okay, so maybe you're walking back, or maybe I just made it too sensationalized to call it your number one favorite. But JD Fassone's hitting biomechanics presentation. Once again, would you like to take it away?
Yeah, I think the JP is former driveline hitting coach. He's now a hitting coordinator with the Red Sox. He had a bit of an interactive presentation. And I think for me, the big theme was understanding this kind of idea that the aesthetics of the swing, the aesthetics of the throw don't matter. What matters is the end goal, right? So it's like the hitting example he gave, people tend to go one direction. It's like, look at the biomechanics. How do the biomechanics affect the swing? How do the swing affect the results? What he suggested is a framework that actually goes the other way. Let's look at the results, the actual on-field production. And when we say, okay, this is something that we've noticed in his on-field production that we want to change, what about the swing is causing that on-field production, that lack in on-field production or whatever? And then what about the biomechanics is causing that in the swing? And so I think the example he gave was this guy who he tended to hit the ball really hard, but he hit it really low. So he'd be hitting ground balls rather than doubles and home runs. And then he also tended to have this ability to miss hit balls and hit like a lot of infield pop-ups. And so I actually don't remember the exact specifics of the swing and the biomechanical the things that he noticed, but he basically said, okay, this is the actual on-field thing that we want to affect change in. There's something about his swing that is causing this. Okay, great. Now when we go back, we say, what about his biomechanics is causing that in his swing? And then this goes back to the test retest cycle, right? We can say like, okay, let's maybe work on this specific drill, this specific thing that smooths out this aspect of the biomechanics in order to affect this part of the swing, in order to actually improve performance and output on the field. And so they did this change. And what they noticed is that the biomechanics didn't actually change substantially, The swing had a little bit of a difference, but the on-field performance actually improved. And at the end of the day, that's what matters. It's not about this part of the swing doesn't look right. This part of the swing, it's not lining up with what other people do. This part of the throw, the pitching delivery does not look good or match up with what other people do. Chris Bassett, Tyler Rogers, and Aroldis Chapman have very, very different throwing mechanics, and all three of them are extremely effective at getting outs. And so at the end of the day, it's like starting with what matters, the actual on-field production, and like using the swing or biomechanics as a tool to actually affect that rather than starting at the aesthetic and like working towards some other nebulous idea of what's good and what's bad.
And that's because you will always find what you're looking for. I was so excited to hear that as a reoccurring theme in the presentation. When JD had his interactive components, there was something along the lines of what can go wrong with a hitting biomech assessment. And the little anonymous thing that I put out there is your biases will shine through. So I felt good. I felt vindicated that I put that on. Yes, back in the day, I did a lot on the hitting side. I was a hitter myself, so I'm very passionate about that. I know I just happen to work in the pitching world currently. I'm a firm believer in that really any biomechanical assessment or any sort of assessment you do, you have to find a way to remove your biases from that assessment. So if you don't really understand the purpose of why you're doing something, you probably shouldn't be doing it. Because if we go into that biomechanical assessment, or if we go to apply that concept to anything, if we go into decision making and we are looking for a result, or we are trying to chase a specific detail, we'll be able to find that. What we need to be open to, or what we need to accept, or we need to be able to label what ultimately matters, what you were saying, and that is the outcome. The outcome is what ultimately matters. Would we care if this hitter in this case stood on his head? No, we wouldn't. Would we care if the hitter hit with a cross grip with his left hand over his right hand? No, we don't. What we care is greater on-field outputs, because that's ultimately going to win games or maybe help this player advance in the system. So I wrote that down as a major takeaway. And then following that point up, which I liked a lot, kind of the bird's eye view approach. The farther away you get from the result, the less concrete we have to be. I don't know if you like how you interpret that, or I guess it's kind of like a general statement anyways, so anybody can take it however they want to. But when we are problem solving, I think that's a good way to frame things from the beginning for true problem definition. Because, of course, if we go down and we look at this guy's swing, I might not like the way his front foot is making contact and then ultimately weight bearing in the swing. But if I zoom out, for instance, for a hitter, I can go back and label, what do I care about? His hard hit rate in the air. Or maybe I can label like the 3 or 4 things that I really care about. And none of those have to do with the way he moves, the way his bat enters the zone, the way he finishes. I might have my preferences, and that's okay because I've had experience with them, or maybe I can look longitudinally and see that there are players that have done similar things that have had positive results. But why should I have that form my thinking? I should have the desired outcome form my thinking.
Yeah, I feel like you see this a lot in the hitting world. I don't know why specifically, but it also happens in the pitching world. But in the hitting world, it's like everyone has like their swing, right? Or it's like, I'm going to teach them my swing. And I think that's just fundamentally starting at the wrong part of the equation. And it's with throwing, it's I'm going to teach them my throw. A lot of times what happens is that these pitching coaches who maybe aren't being informed by a motion capture report or not being informed by like composite scores or like these things that are actually valuable tools that kind of narrow, which I view them as like a GPS in the search space, right? Like you're not going to tell you exactly where to go or exactly what to do, but it kind of gives you a good idea of where to start looking. And a lot of people, what they tend to do is like what I tell athletes to do is what worked for me as an athlete. And so I have these individual constraints about me that are different than you do, that are different than every other pitcher on the planet, right? We all have these unique set of individual constraints. And so like what worked for me as a pitcher might not work for Edwin Diaz, or Edwin Diaz, what works for him might not work for me. And so when you start with this idea of like the aesthetics of the swing, the aesthetics of the throw, you kind of put people in a box, and oftentimes they may not fit in that box. It's not going to be the solution that's actually optimal for them to get on-field results. And I think it's unfortunate when that's the case because it could lead to people going down a path that's actually not going to help them improve.
Something that I think offered reassurance as well to me is I at least know JD's approach to coaching or problem solving is very similar to how problem solving and planning was discussed in business school for me. And that was through backwards planning. JD reiterated time and time again, starting with the end result and working back from there. So then, if we start with the end result, we are able to create a roadmap back to our starting point, as
Yep.
opposed to starting where we are and having no clue where our ultimate destination is. This is truly the equivalent of me telling you to get in a car and come drive to me, but you have no idea where I am. This is giving a player the feedback in a development meeting saying like, hey, we want you to be a big league all-star. Awesome. I want to be a big league all-star too. But you have not given me any tools or any path to actually get there. Versus if we start with we need you to do these things like objective measures, we think you can get to this zone percentage, this whiff rate on this pitch. You are so much better at data and statistics than I am in the baseball world, so you could probably correct me and say what would actually be a better example here. But if you start with that, then as a player you at least know the benchmarks you need to hit along the way to
Yeah.
ultimately achieve the goal of being a big league all-star.
Well, yeah. So it's like the hitting side we talked about. It's like, all right, you want to hit pull side, hard hit balls in the air so you can do damage like doubles and home runs. Ideally, you wouldn't swing and miss very often. Like obviously, there's a trade-off there with probably the damage aspect. From a pitching perspective, it's like, all right, I want to like to get outs, you have to like limit damage. You can't put guys on for free. And like ideally, you'd strike guys out, but like you can probably get away with that like not striking out a ton of guys if you're not walking guys and you're getting a lot of weak contact, right? So we start with like the end result of like the actual like batted ball outcomes or like at bat outcomes we want to see. And then yeah, you have these like you start getting back. It's like, okay, well, maybe a way I can do that is by getting a higher zone percentage early in counts or by getting more swing and miss on my slider. How do I get more swing and miss on my slider? Okay, I increase the stuff plus in my slider. How do I increase the stuff plus in my slider? Maybe it's a different grip, right? And so like there's different like you can work backwards, but working forward and saying like, oh, I want to change the grip of my slider, but without knowing where you're going, it's exactly what you're saying. You just kind of get lost. Error propagates through the system, and there's just no real. It's not an efficient path of making players better.
Well, the direct example is here. I have it written down actually. I'm assuming this is both JD's and the Red Sox system. The core four, as he phrased it, bat speed, bat to ball flight, and swing decisions.
Sure.
So if we know that as a player, if we can optimize for those four things, it can guide our decision making in the process. Maybe in order to make better swing decisions or optimize for bat speed, we do need to change our stance or we do need to change the way the bat enters the zone.
Sure.
But those shouldn't be the drivers. Those should be a possible change or alteration we make in the process that lead us back to the core four that ultimately affect how successful we can be.
Yep, couldn't agree more. Overall, love this presentation from JP. The Red Sox are really building.
Oh, it's JP,
line.
and I've been calling him JD.
Yeah, JD Martinez, Red Sox. It's all right. We can dub it over in post.
I don't know about that. I don't quite have that skill. I'm just going to admit fault here, and I'm going to blame it on my D's and P's look too similar on the way I wrote it down. But I actually do have it as JD, so I just added a little length to that D on here. So now it officially is a P in my notes. So you are going to be in charge of giving this a final rating. If this presentation were a pizza, what pizza order would it be?
It definitely wouldn't have pineapple on it. I think it would just be like a classic, like Sicilian slice from L&B Spumoni Gardens in Brooklyn. That's what I would give it.
Okay, excellent. Very specific rating system, but I trust that's extremely good.
It is. It's very good.
So then it looks like our next presentation is capping off night one with the college pitching coach panel. That
Yeah.
included Volts from Notre Dame, Dorman from Oregon State, DeRoyne, formerly of Arizona, now of the
Now
New
the
York
Mets,
Mets, and Mangrum of Ole Miss.
Ole Miss. I don't have a ton to add about this panel specifically. I don't know if you have a lot of notes that stuck out to you. I think the big thing for me is just it was cool hearing them talk about the different deliverables they use, how
Hmm.
they talk about some of this stuff with their athletes. But yeah, generally thought it was just really cool to hear from these coaches. But nothing like crazy stuck out to me. I don't know if there's anything in your mind.
Yeah, I'll just run through the notes and maybe you stop me at any point if there's something you want to get into. First bullet point I have here, I know is from Volts at Notre Dame. Player reports should present controllable metrics. And I
Mm,
thought that was incredibly important, especially at the college level. If you are going to present something to a player, there's no sense presenting something that is completely out of his control. Because
sure.
let's face it, you cannot control something that is uncontrollable. So why even address it? Why make someone feel bad about it? They had no say in what ultimately happened.
Well, a lot of the reports I've gotten in pro ball remove basically like earned runs from the report for that exact reason, right? It's like how much did you get ahead? How many strikes did you throw? Like what were your missed distances? What was the like the shapes of all your pitches? And like maybe these more process oriented goals. But yeah, a lot of these reports that I've gotten, like earned runs wasn't even on the report because there's a lot out of your control that can go into that.
The next point I actually want to push back on a little bit, and that's why I wrote it down. I put a little question mark on it. But it was players want colors, players want something simple. And I think simple works if you are just trying to get immediate feedback. But what I think was a resounding takeaway from our talk the next morning, literally kicking off Saturday, was something that really runs counter to that point. If players are given the information, they can make decisions for themselves for the most part. Yes, there's some sort of education that needs to be had in the process so players can make sense of what they're being handed. So, yeah, players probably want something simple if they've never been exposed to something more. It's almost like the allegory of the cave for me, in the sense that if you keep players in the dark, any little bit they get's going to feel great. But as soon as you turn on that light or you take someone out of the cave and you show them what this world can be and what this information can do to empower them, I think you're going to have guys that are going to start to want more and more. Don't get me wrong, like you can hit a point of being overwhelmed, but I would rather work towards that point of being overwhelmed and step back rather than withholding.
I think it also depends on like performance versus development settings, right? Like a performance setting, you probably want to keep things very simple. You don't want them thinking like about random stuff when they're on the mound or at the bat.
Mm-hmm.
Like you want them to be like very, very actionable. In like a more development setting, like this is what we want to work on and why, and like here's all the information that shows that. I think you can definitely have more information. I'm definitely someone who is on the side of like using as much information as possible to kind of like feed into the back end of things. And like on the front end, like even if it's something like knowing what I got to work on, knowing very simply and actionably like what that is I need to do is really important. And then maybe digging into the reasons why I can dig into some of these more complex reasons and understanding. But like I also agree with what you're saying. I think there is like an appetite for players to like want all this information to like truly understand where they stand and take ownership of their own careers, which I think is really powerful.
So maybe if we can provide an actionable takeaway on that point is creating a fall report versus a spring report
Yeah,
or a
maybe.
development report versus a competition report.
Definitely pregame and postgame should be different as well, right? Like pregame of like the advanced scouting report like should be very, very simple, actionable. Maybe the postgame report's a little bit more in the weeds of like here's kind of your trends and like what you should be working on and stuff like that. Like there's all these like little nuances of like different settings that maybe have different types of there are different levels of information.
And knowing that these are the college coaches, starters are throwing once a week. That's it.
Yeah.
They're going to throw on the same day every single week for the year, unless they're in a conference that's on TV and their games get pushed around a little bit. But that means every week there is a true development segment to the schedule.
No
It's not
doubt.
like these guys are on some controlled free fall like in pro ball and you're just trying to stay afloat and make sure you feel healthy each time you get handed the ball. These guys have a chance to get better during the week, which I think for me, it leans back into my personal bias of wanting more instead of it being as simple as possible.
Yep, I agree. I agree. I think that's it's powerful to like have an athlete take ownership of what they want to do with their career, and sometimes data information is needed.
The next bullet point I have here is something that I think speaks volumes of the culture at Ole Miss. You guys heard me say earlier, I really like seeing the sociology within these various teams, but Mangrum said that the pitching staff votes on their pitching pillars every year.
Yeah.
Now, does that mean it's going to be the most specific thing that impacts performance in the end? Maybe not. But what I love there is that the players have a say in what they deem is important. And if
Yep.
the players assess what's important, the likelihood that they adhere to those requirements to me is going to go sky high. It's going to shoot through
Without
the
a
roof.
doubt. I completely agree.
Let's see. It looks like I have a couple quotes here. I'll see if anything really stands out to me. I apologize, listeners, as I just kind of fill dead air as I read my notes. Big point here. I forget who made it, but on the pitch design side, Hejka, this is all too familiar to you, but somebody on the panel said, learn the miss, especially in development, get comfortable doubling up on it to enable corrections. Yeah, I'll hand it over to you since you are the pitcher.
Well, I will say this. I think people, especially in a pitch design setting, so I think a lot of times a big mistake I see with pitchers is that they throw 10 sliders in a row to like really find it and make it feel good, right? And I think that's okay early in an off season, maybe when you're first learning a pitch, right? This idea of like let's block out some time of only throwing this pitch and like really develop a feel for what I'm trying to accomplish here. But the ultimate goal and the ultimate usage in game is almost always within a random context. I'm never throwing 10 straight sliders in a game and to find it, right? Like, that's just something I never have the opportunity to do. And so if it takes me 10 sliders to feel like I can throw a good one, I've lost the plot, right? In a game, I need to throw my changeup, my fastball, and then go to a slider in a 1-2 count and put the guy away then. I can't throw 3 more in a row to make sure that I throw a good one. And so our training should reflect that, especially as we approach the season, where you should practice going from your other pitches to your other pitches, because that's how they're going to be used in the game. That's going to challenge you to get better. And it might be harder to do it, right? Like it's going to be hard to do this in practice. It's going to be hard to throw a good slider immediately after throwing 3 other pitches. But the idea isn't being good in practice. It's being able to access that ability in the game. And if you're just never training that in practice, you're never going to be able to do that. So I do think maybe this is a little bit of a tangent. I just generally think that there should be some higher level of variability and like this kind of like replicating how the pitch is actually going to be used in the game, whether that's through a pitch design session or like just general bullpen sessions. But that's my rant.
I've got a question now directly for you on that specific rant you made. So forget about anything that's going to be on our notes. This is more a concept that I was told in professional baseball development. So a former minor league pitching coordinator who now is, I believe, a big league assistant is what his title is. I could be wrong on that, but I know he has some sort of big league role at this point. Don't know the official title. One of the things that he told me in a minor league pitch design session, so actually at the complex, not necessarily like a true off season or like in a driveline type setting. What he told me was that he wants an individual to pick one grip, stick with it for a full session, and spend at least 50% of the time, if not more, throwing that specific pitch. His idea was, at least at that point, when the guy goes into a game, he doesn't care if the result is shitty. At least the player has 1 point, one feel. I'll step back and phrase this better. He has burned the boats at that point. There is no
Sure.
going back to another grip. There is no, like, I'm going to make this adjustment, or maybe I'll try that other feel that I was messing around with. So if you go with one feel, although the results might not be great, you at least have an objective for that session.
So this comes back to this idea of like skill periodization, right? Like early on when learning a skill. And so this idea that I'm talking about of like this blocked practice of like 15 sliders in a row versus random practice of like bouncing back and forth between pitch types. It's an idea called contextual interference, which has like a lot of research backed up on it. I'd highly advise people listening, if they're curious, like to look up this concept called contextual interference to learn more. And so what we actually find is that for beginners, less contextual interference is good. So it's exactly what you're saying. If I'm first learning a pitch for the first time, I shouldn't be doing what I'm talking about. I should be doing exactly what this coach talks about, right? I should be throwing it a ton to basically learn a feel and find some stability in the pitch that I'm trying to throw. The point is, once you have that stability, right? Like once I know what a good pitch is, I should be challenging it with some of this randomness and variability because that's going to allow me to apply it in a game context more easily. And so athletes who are beginners need lower levels of contextual interference. Athletes who are experts or have like a lot of stability need more levels of contextual interference. And so the problem is when we don't bridge that gap, when we only give a guy low levels of contextual interference, only throw 10 sliders in a row to find it, and we never actually challenge him with these high levels of contextual interference. So I actually completely agree with what the coach is saying, especially for a guy just learning a pitch. But it's like as the season's going on and you're going to want to apply it in a game setting after throwing 4 different other pitches, that's when you really need to start challenging it with the variability.
That makes sense. And I appreciate you digging a little bit deeper on that. So I guess once again, there's no right, there's no wrong. It's just all within the context of the problem at hand.
For sure. It's another idea called like the point of optimal challenge. Well, we don't want to incentivize people to be really good in practice. We want them to be good in game. And sometimes that requires failure in practice because that's going to allow you to learn and actually be better in the game. If the only time you study for the test is on the flashcards that you already know the answer to, that's great. You succeeded at studying, but like you're going to fail the test. And so you have to fail in studying sometimes in order to actually do better on the test, which is the game. The test is the game.
Yes. Which I think the point you just made actually relates back to JP's presentation a little bit.
You mean JD?
What is the end result what is the desired end result?
Yeah.
And like, yes, you can succeed at those things along the way, but if those things that you're succeeding at along the way don't support the outcome that is actually going to enable you to be successful, then what's the point? Now I'm going to share a little opinion here about this panel. I've got a couple other notes here that I don't think add a ton of context to the discussion, so I'll leave them on my sheet of paper. But I think going forward, if this could be improved in future years. So I apologize to be armchair quarterback here saying like, oh, it would be better for this reason. But my takeaway or my opinion would be I would like to see coaches with different budgets or environmental constraints on that panel. Again, those schools were Notre Dame, Oregon State, Arizona, and Ole Miss.
Yeah.
Let's face it, like those guys.
Let's get a D3 coach in there.
Yeah, D3, NAIA, JUCO, even a mid-major D1 in the sense that you are dealing with very different problems. DeRoyne, who's now with the Mets, mentioned that the team is playing Thursday, Friday, Saturday in the fall, and then he's going to give each pitcher a 3-page report and have a 15 to 20-minute meeting with each pitcher on staff across Monday and Tuesday. Now, that is amazing. I am so jealous of that situation that he was in at Arizona. That's an amazing problem to have that much data and that much time to dedicate to your players to go through development. But that doesn't happen at the D2 level, the D3 level.
Yeah, that wasn't happening at Johns Hopkins.
Yeah. You're not getting an action report. Your action report is maybe your charted inning.
Bob Babb was handwriting our charts. So yeah, we got those handwritten charts handed over to us.
Yeah, I mean ours was a handwritten scorebook with your top and bottom velocity for each inning. Like sick. What are pitchers gonna do with that? Like, yeah, I suppose it's better than nothing, so you at least know what your results were. You can call back on them. I don't really know what else to say on that. Of just like I would like a different perspective. Like, how are these problems being solved? Yeah. Because the problems for those 4, and not just those 4, but any Power 4 school for the most part, versus any non-Power 4 school across any other level, are going to be very different. And I'd like to know how others solve the time constraint or solve the budgetary constraint.
Yeah, I think that'd be very interesting, especially for like a future presentation. I think that makes a lot of sense. Having a wide variety of like I think the term used is environmental constraints, like different constraints on your program that you have to adapt around. I think that'd be cool.
So we will refrain from reviewing the after hours social on Friday night. We'll just say it was tremendous presentations, good food. I enjoyed myself. I mean, that's where a lot of the connections are made. So if anyone, maybe we'll just say this is a piece of advice. If anyone goes to any conventions or seminars, get involved in the social. It doesn't mean get hammered and drink with all the boys. Go out, talk to people, learn people's experiences, hear their
Yes.
stories. I mean, from that, I developed friendships with these people. I developed working connections where maybe we can collaborate on a future project, or I at least know that if something is up somebody's alley, I can lean on them in the future.
Yep, no doubt. Couldn't agree more.
All right.
Then we had a bright and early wake up call.
That's right. What's our
Do you want to
phrase,
go
Josh?
into our panel, or should we just wait, or should we, since that's going to be its own episode, should we just let that?
Quick highlights. So I know that's going to come out before this. At least that's my intention now. If that fails, I apologize everyone for how I introed this episode, and you're just going to have to deal with it because I'm not going to revise it. We're just going to ride. But yeah, our player panel, we talked a little bit about it with what Wake presented on, and then what this college panel presented on. I guess we didn't mention too much of it, but how they communicate with players. I guess kind of the ethos, in a sense, behind our presentation. Shout out my junior year high school English teacher for ethos, pathos, and kairos.
It's good memory.
Thank you.
That's good.
Darren Broadway. But the motivator in our presentation and what we kind of anchored everything in was giving the power to the players to actually tell coaches, clinicians, trainers, whoever has a say in a player's development or their career, how a player actually interprets and utilizes data, information, and the stories that are being presented to them.
Yeah, and it was me, three other guys, and yeah,
Don't worry, Blake Morningstar, Dawson Nets, and Aiden May. I'll be the one to say the names because I know you're not a names guy, you're a numbers guy.
Yeah, we'll go with that. But yeah, it was great. It was a wide variety of perspectives, and honestly, what we kind of went into it approaching it is like, let's say how we really feel. Like, let's not find this like artificial convergence to the same opinion, because I think sometimes that happens on these panels where people don't want to rile the boat. They don't want to like disagree with other people. That it's like, oh, like, yeah, what he said. And so we kind of went into it and we weren't really afraid to disagree with each other, which I thought was very impactful. And yeah, I think overall, I haven't watched back the video, but I think we shared some pretty cool insights that coaches probably don't often get to hear from players.
Well, that video is going to be our holiday present to the masses. It's coming out on Thursday, Christmas Day. So
Love it.
It will be out prior to this. At least it's already scheduled in the YouTube. So we're ready to rock with that. If people haven't listened to it and they're listening to this episode, I highly suggest going to YouTube for it, because I actually think the YouTube quality is better than the podcast quality. So there's a little rec, I guess, from the future to the past, or from the past to the future, whatever. All right. So then we move into the regularly scheduled programming with the Cubs player development presentation, maybe the most appealing presentation from like an actual, I think, enjoyment factor, engagement factor. At least that's what I would say. Oh, and we forgot to give ratings to everything. Whatever, we'll move on. It was fun while it lasted. But the beauty of Bolognese flavor development or player development. But that's our title. Josh, I'll kick it back to you to start off with this one.
Yeah, so the general idea here, and he was talking a lot about pasta, and I'm just like, what in the world is going on? Yeah, I think he did a very nice job of building it up and identifying the problem, which is that a lot of times that there's this kind of like quality quantity trade-off, and oftentimes they're primarily looking through a hitting lens, but a lot of times there's this issue where like if you have a guy participate in a large quantity of reps, oftentimes the quality diminishes, and it's just you kind of lose some work, and like sometimes it's not even possible to get a large quantity of reps in due to certain time constraints with the schedule or how the schedule is even structured. And so this idea of Bolognese is a combination of Bulgarian and Japanese. The pronunciations don't line up exactly, but that's kind of
Bolognese to Bolognese.
Yeah, it's close enough. And so the Bulgarian schedule they talked about were these Bulgarian weightlifters from the Soviet bloc who basically had like 3 or 4 high intensity lifting sessions in a single day. And they also talked about the Japanese, I believe it was like a screenshot from like the Little League World Series, kind of talking about like some of the practices these youth teams go through, which are very just like very long whole day affairs. And so the Cubs basically talked about how they, Jason Kanzler, they talked about how they implemented a schedule in the Dominican Republic with the primary purpose of increasing the quantity of reps and maximizing the quality of reps wherever they can. And the way they did this is shorter, higher intensity sessions throughout a day. So more sessions rather than like, here's your warm-up block, and then here's your hitting block, and then here's your strength and conditioning block. They had smaller sessions, shorter sessions with rest in between, and a very, very high quality of rep in each of those sessions. Whether that's they have like a very short weightlifting block to start the day, and then they go do a short hitting block, and then they go do something else, and they do another short hitting block, and then they do another lifting block. It allowed them, from their perspective, to get a higher quantity of reps, and then from their subjective perspective, a larger quality of rep as well. One interesting takeaway I had was this kind of idea of when you're preparing an athlete, like the fitness of building up the chronic workload, the fitness of an athlete, you don't necessarily want to build them to prepare the demands of the game, which is kind of how I always thought about it, at least from an injury perspective. But from a development perspective, you're not preparing a hitter to take 15 swings a day or 10 swings a day. What you actually need to do is build the player up to handle the demands of the practice they need to get better. If a guy needs to do a ton of training because he's like bottom of the roster guy and he's going to need to get a lot better, you need to be able to build this guy up to prepare to handle 200, 300, 400 swings a day. Maybe that's, I don't know what hitters do. Maybe that's too much. But a lot of
150 is usually going to be our
Sure.
absolute peak.
So a lot of swings, way more than they would experience in a game. Same thing with a pitcher, right? Like if I don't throw very hard and I'm going to get cut next year, I shouldn't just prepare to handle the 20 pitches in a relief inning that I'm going to need to experience in a game. I probably need to build up way more than that so I get way more reps and opportunities to work on the things I need to work on, which I thought was a very powerful idea. That's the one that stuck with me the most from that presentation.
Kind of along the same lines is I wrote down the continuum that they kind of anchored the presentation in of no effect or no effective dose. Like we're doing nothing. Then we have our minimum effective dose to the tolerable dose in this larger window. And then above that is the maximum dose possible, or basically doing way too much. Oftentimes in pro ball or in development, we talk about reaching that minimum effective dose. You kind of hear it from our presentation. This is something Dawson Netz talks about routinely. He talked about it on his podcast that he did for Layback, is finding what is minimally effective so then he can recover and then be at his best the next day. That's the stage of his development that he is in. Define what he minimally needs to get as much return as possible to then step away. The difference is Dawson is a 25-year-old. The Dominican, we are often working with 16 to 19-year-olds.
Yeah.
Thus, we flip the minimum effective dose and do more what you said, identify the tolerable dose, or what is ultimately needed to make improvements. Not just expose yourself to a stimulus, but put in the necessary work or as much work as you possibly can to be as good as you can be, and then still come back the next day and repeat it.
Even within a single person, these can be different things, right? If I'm a guy who has like a ton of lean muscle mass, I'm incredibly strong in the weight room, I probably just need the minimum effective dose in the weight room because like any additional gains there are going to have very, very marginal utility. Like it's going to be diminishing returns. And I want to spend my training economy elsewhere on the throwing side, for example. And so I'm going to actually go up to my maximum tolerable dose on the throwing side and use my minimum effective dose on the lifting side, if that's the type of person I am. And so these different traits can exist within the same guy, even. It's not necessarily one guy has to always use the minimum effective dose and one guy always has to use the maximum tolerable dose.
Another thing they outlined, which I very much appreciated seeing on some slides, is what obstacles really exist. People create these ideas of false constraints, or that's what they labeled this as. The real constraints, at least from the player development side, are roster pressure and recovery. Like, what else? Like, yeah, time, that's a real constraint, but everyone has to deal with the time problem. So why even throw that in there? Versus the other things that people throw in, the weather. Like, you can find a way around the weather. I don't know. Field quality. You can find a way around field quality, or coaches available. You can find ways around that stuff.
Even to tie this back to some of the previous presentations, a false constraint in player development is the aesthetic of a swing or throw. Yes. That's not actually a real constraint. I don't have to look a certain way, whatever, right? As long as I'm getting the results. And so like, I think this idea of really separating like what are the real things I'm constrained by versus like what are these fake constraints I'm putting on myself because I have a preconceived notion. One example of this is one of my friends was talking to me and he's like, when I throw my plyos before I go play long toss, it doesn't feel right. I just don't feel like I'm getting a lot out of these plyos. And I'm like, well, why do you do your plyos before you're throwing? He's like, well, that's what everyone does, right? And I'm like, why don't you go long toss and then come back in and throw your plyos? Now he's updated his routine because he finds that so much more effective for him rather than this like fake constraint of like, oh, you have to do your plyos before you do your long toss. So I think it's a really powerful idea. I'm a big fan of this idea.
Which the exact point you just made leads to the next quote that I was going to bring up. Hopefully wrote this down exactly as they said it, but different isn't better, but different is where better lives. I thought it was a very powerful quote. You don't need to just chase being different, but maybe this quote empowers you to step away and better determine why you would do something differently. Mm-hmm. For the exact example you just gave, whoever that athlete was so concerned with the status quo that they just misinterpreted why they even utilize plyos, or like what is the purpose of a plyo. Yep. And yes, there are general purposes of doing these things. Maybe the most general is I do it to help me on the mound. Great. But then determine why it helps you on the mound. But nowhere in that does the order in which you throw a plyo in your own throwing program matter.
Yep. Couldn't agree more.
Let's see if there's anything else in the notes that I think is really worth labeling. They did get into the details of how they structured this system. I did find that interesting. Them labeling on kind of a volume intensity chart. What is a 1? What is a 2? What is a 3? What is a 4? Now I'm going to do poor podcasting because no one can see what my hands are doing. But 1 would be closest to the XY axis, the origin point. A 2 would be higher on the volume with no real increase in intensity. A 3 would be an increase in intensity, but no real increase in volume. And a 4 would be an increase in both volume and intensity.
That's an extremely, I think, powerful idea that they talked about too, is kind of living in the corners, right? You want to be like really high intensity, really low volume, or really high volume, really low intensity. And they talked about how they also do just general athletic development, like, oh, let's go play spike ball, or let's go like do these like different things. And that kind of lives in the middle, but it's like, it's not too taxing that you're going to be too tired for the session the next day. But it kind of allows you to build some of these more general athletic traits that can maybe be applied in other areas.
And what they are doing is educating the player on, I guess, that physical literacy. I don't know if that was the phrasing they used. Maybe they did, and I just didn't write it down. Now it's cemented in my brain, but I'm going to choose to say
that's a good way of saying
sounding smart. They are educating the player on what fatigue they might be able to expect from a different activity. Or maybe if a player doesn't know, or they don't know how hard to go, or what this looks like for their total development and recovery schedule, if they're educated on it, they can make a better decision on their energy expenditure. Or if they are in a place of whatever, these guys are in the Dominican complex, they have other constraints that we might not know. They have English class that they have to go to. They have these different things that they have to do. Maybe they have to spend more time in English class on a given day. It means that they are missing the team stretch. I don't know. Like, I don't know the lives of these guys. And if that's the case, then the player at least knows, like, okay, I miss my one activity for the day. If I miss my one activity for the day, what can I do to ensure that I check the box on that workload expenditure?
Yep. I think it's well said. I think, just like the holistic view of the athlete. And like sometimes maybe it's like the guy's issues going on at home. He's breaking up with his girlfriend, or like in college, in a college setting, he's like studying for finals. Like maybe we actually do need to dial it back a little bit on the training side because he's got all this extra stress in his life that he has to deal with as well. That's you can't remove. You can't remove that stress of taking a final, for example.
This is going to be a challenge to the industry now because you said the breakup with the girlfriend example. I have certainly said that every time when we talk about fatigue or other stimuli that can impact total outputs. Maybe we need to convene at the next convention or summit and just determine what other non-physical.
It's everything. The answer is everything.
Yes.
Everything.
The true answer is everything.
Yeah, it's all the same to the central nervous system. It is.
Work is work, and fatigue is fatigue.
Stress,
yeah, stress is stress. So yeah, I think with that we're probably good. on the Cubs player development presentation. So if we're going to go back to our ratings, it was a very good bolognese. They presented a concept that is near and dear to all of us, meat sauce. I love eating meat sauce. At the end of the day, it's going to make me happy if someone is hitting me with meat sauce or meatballs or some equivalent of that. So I have no problem saying that on my Italian foods rating
Love it.
system, I'm assigning this bolognese presentation as bolognese on the rating scale.
Fantastic.
That brings us to balling on a budget with Denton McNamee, pitching coach at Lindenwood University, and Jacob Buffa, the now director of international scouting for the St. Louis Cardinals, former farm director, and probably another like 6 fancy titles with the Houston Astros.
I will just say that I just wanted to add in that they have a facility called Elite Baseball Academy. That's what they were
Yeah,
referencing.
yeah, yeah. I
You
guess
got it.
I should have added that in the title because so much of their presentation was actually on Elite Baseball Academy. So balling on a budget. No, the Cardinals probably aren't operating with the same budgetary constraints that most of us are, but maybe in terms of player development and Major League Baseball, they are certainly not operating with the heaviest of hitters. Could they? Maybe. But compared to Yankees, Phillies, Dodgers, they're not spending on that level by any means.
Sure.
And then Denton at Lindenwood, and prior to Lindenwood, Maryville University. I'm assuming most people on here, unless they have followed Denton and what we've talked about with him, they're not spending money at those schools. The only time they're spending money is if they definitely need to, or if something ranks high on their wants list and they deem it as a need, which probably decently sets up this presentation. When you don't have a lot of money, you are in a position where you need to make calculated gambles. I underline the word calculated because you have to mitigate risk in the process. The way that these guys define this was by anchoring everything in the how and the why. Yeah, we can talk about the how and the why as buzzwords all the time, but kind of going back to what we've heard in other presentations is define the problem that you are wishing to solve, determine how you can solve that problem. And if you do not have the tools in-house to solve that problem or within an arm's reach, determine in what manner you are going to go outside, what purchase you might make, to what level of purchase you ultimately need to make, and then be able to clearly define why that purchase is necessary. So we saw that with force plates, specifically with EBA or Elite Baseball Academy. And then we saw that with Flex Pro, cool enough to say Flex Pro, for Lindenwood University. So I will dish it back to you now. That's my initial overview. Hejka, please take it away.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that stuck out to me the most, which I actually learned in this presentation, which I thought was pretty cool, which also this presentation, I think, is a good kind of manifestation of what you were talking about earlier with maybe trying to get some more representation with like lower budget facilities or teams. And this kind of idea of I think it's called like the quadrant of innovation. And they're talking about this idea of the quadrant of innovation. It's you have existing technology to new technology on one axis. And then you have existing market to new market on the other axis. And so an example of an existing technology and an existing market, the first thing that came to my head was like, okay, we already use radar guns in baseball and it's an existing technology, but now people are starting to use it throughout the return to throw process in rehab. So it's an existing tech, an existing market, but it's still an innovation. Next, if you have an existing technology, but a new market, the first one is called an incremental innovation. If you have an existing technology and you're introducing it to a new market, it's called an architectural innovation. And so an example of this that I believe they gave was the Edgertronic camera, which was used in like bird watching, right? Or like these like crazy like niche hobbies. People realized the frame rate is extremely high. It has these uses in baseball. It's an existing technology, but it has a use in a new market. On the new tech side, if you have an existing market, but you have new technology, that it's called a radical innovation. I believe the example they gave was Flex Pro Grip, if I'm not mistaken.
New tech, new market was radical.
Sorry, new tech, existing market.
That is disruptive.
Wow, I had it backwards and unfortunate. So that was actually, okay, disruptive. And then the radical innovation, which would be the new tech, new market. An example I think they gave was like TrackMan, basically creating the entire field of ball flight physics.
Right.
Right. We didn't even know this was a thing. Now we have like teams have like dozens of people dedicated to analyzing this data and making decisions and evaluating players on this data. So it was a really interesting concept that I hadn't heard before. And I think it's just a very valuable idea. And I think they said from their perspective as a low budget facility that they tried to focus on kind of this like existing technology column of like they're not going to have this resources to build new technology or develop their own new technology. So they have to kind of rely on some of this existing technology and implement it in the scales of their system.
And probably digging a little bit deeper on that, part of the reason they felt they could go the existing tech, existing market world is because the problem that they were looking to solve was answered by technology that was in that space. Because their goal or what they talked about with EBA was creating higher swing speeds or increasing exit velocity, I think was the term that they use for batted ball metrics. But to even get to that point, we then were taken through the decision trees that they used and ultimately how those decision trees led to the decision to invest in force plates. Same kind of thing then with Denton at Lindenwood in deciding to get Flex Pro Grip. He knew that the best ability is availability. Shout out Aiden May for that phrase because I think he butchered it about 7 times during our presentation. So now I'm doing the same thing. But at a mid-major where you might not have a deep roster, especially on the pitching staff, you need your horses to be available. If that's the case, you need to assess readiness. If you are going to assess readiness, you need to determine how to assess readiness. What tools can you use? Then you begin to look at what's on the market. If nothing that is publicly available or that you have in your graphs can do that, you need to look elsewhere. Enter the disruptive innovation of Flex Pro Grip. That was really cool to see. I knew Denton was going to mention Flex Pro Grip, but I didn't know in what capacity and how he was going to label it. That felt really good, not going to lie. But then on the EBA side, they were going through how much the weight room can impact batted ball metrics. And great, like you can give a kid a training program, but how effective is that training program? And just because you lift more weights doesn't mean you can hit the ball harder. You need to apply force, transfer force, all these different things that ultimately go into putting a bat on a baseball. And yes, they can do swing mechanics and all these things, but where EBA was made, or their nuts and bolts, was the strength component or the physical preparation component, and then tying that into the baseball world. Thus, force plates fit perfectly with their own niche, and it makes sense how they got to that point in the decision tree. So although decision trees might not have been the crux or the intended crux of this presentation, I believe, at least for me, that was the most powerful part in encouraging coaches or decision makers to create a decision tree so then you can actually determine what you can affect.
Yep, I thought that was a really cool concept as well. Yeah, I agree. I thought it was very powerful, breaking things down into constituent, like atomic parts that you can build back up, and knowing exactly where those branches terminate, I think is extremely important.
And then as a follow-up or the secondary piece on those decision trees, Jacob Buffa answered this during the Q&A, is you have to have some tolerance to being wrong. In our world where we're trying to impact player performance, there's going to be some extent that you could be wrong or there's some risk involved. Someone might get hurt. You might present a poor outcome. So every decision you make can come with inherent risk, and you have to be the one that determines how much of that risk you are willing to incur.
This is such a phenomenal idea, and this exists in so many different aspects. I think I've heard this before of like NBA players, right? Where it's like if you're shooting 90% from the field, that means you're not shooting enough.
Yes.
Because like there's at some point, and so like I mean, there's million applications of this. If you're never getting rejected at the bar when you approach a woman, you're not asking out enough women. Like you're not asking out a high enough, like you know what I'm saying? Like you have to go above your league then. Like you have to keep going up because like the whole point is like you shouldn't be right every time. Like you should be taking calculated risks that have a higher payoff. And so if you're only ever doing the things that you know are sure things, you're not actually optimizing for long-term success.
The Guardians did this specifically with Stephen Kwan on the hitting side a couple years ago, I believe. He had, I think, the second lowest swing and miss rate in the entire league behind Luis Ariz. If you're second behind Luis Ariz, you're probably in a pretty good place. But they showed that Quan was incredibly effective when he had like a certain amount of slug or expected slug in games. But the problem
Mm-hmm.
was he was just taking so many pitches, and then when he swung, he made contact literally every single time. So they wanted him to just swing more and get comfortable swinging harder, not focusing as much on contact. The problem is he is such an elite contact tool that he didn't decrease his swing and miss, or he didn't increase his swing and miss rate at all. But what was crazy, his contact skill was so high, it still resulted in more total hits as opposed to chasing a walk or chasing on base. So even though that wasn't the intended positive consequence, it still resulted in a positive outcome, which I
Yeah.
find really interesting. Like just because you make a decision doesn't mean it's always going to be A plus B equals C in our world of extreme variability. But it doesn't mean just because it doesn't equal C that you're not always going to immediately have a negative. You could still have some extraneous positive result in the decisions that you make. Like I'm sure these guys doing all the force plate work, not only did they swing harder or have higher exit velos, I'm sure it resulted in faster athletes as well. And although
Mm-hmm.
they didn't care about guys 60 times, they probably improved their 60 times in the process.
Yep. No, I think it's great. I could talk about this the exact topic for hours and hours and
Yeah,
hours.
yeah, we
I
could do a podcast on this theory.
I probably need to like write something down about this because I've had these thoughts swimming in my head. But it was great stuff from those guys, and yeah, it was a good presentation, especially kind of referring to what you're talking about of talking about these different constraints that coaches have to deal with, that and not everyone has the luxury of working for the Dodgers and have just access to everything they want.
Okay, moving on. Leading into lunchtime on Saturday, we have the strength and conditioning panel. I
Mm,
will say it from the jump. I do wish they talked a little bit more about strength and conditioning principles as opposed
yeah.
to workload.
Yeah, I agree. I thought it was they did talk a lot about workload, which I think is an important topic, but there wasn't a ton about actual strength and conditioning, which I would have liked to hear those guys' perspective. Those guys, I mean, still they offer their thoughts. I thought it was still some valuable information, but I didn't have any like crazy big takeaways personally.
Yeah, maybe I'll just read through the notes. There's Nick Shed, Chris Martin, Brandon Golden, and Mark Seaver. Nick Shed is, I believe, the strength coordinator with the Red Sox. Hopefully, I got that right. Chris Martin is the head strength and conditioning coach at LSU. Brandon Golden works in the private sector. He runs Ghost Lab in North Carolina. He's formerly a strength coach in the Dodgers organization. And Mark Seaver. I'm familiar and work relatively closely with three of those four guys. The only one I don't know is Nick Shed. Some really good minds on those other three for sure. I'm sure Nick Shed has an incredible mind. I just don't really know him. So I don't want that to sound bad that I don't call him an incredible mind. This is the first time I've ever heard him speak. Reoccurring themes, all these guys spoke on objective feedback. Really, if there's been any place that has objective feedback in baseball for the longest time, it's actually probably been the weight room because there are numbers on weights. At a minimum, we know what reps and sets are. But the beauty is now there's other things involved, like force plates or like velocity based training, so we can actually gauge levels of fatigue. One hot button topic that I did think was great to hear a little bit about was aerobic capacity and how far the pendulum has swung in the baseball world, focusing on anaerobic output or short sprints. We have to have this sport specific training of baseball is such a short burst sport. So pitchers should only train in short bursts, hitters should only train in short bursts, just maximize rotational velocities. Yes, all those things are incredible and probably necessary, but let's face it, everybody needs some sort of aerobic base. And I do think it's great that these guys dove a little deeper on that concept.
Yeah, I think the most important takeaway in that sense is like this idea of second order effects, right? Like maybe aerobic capacity isn't directly related to your ability to get outs on the mound, but if a higher aerobic base allows you to get better quality and quantity of reps throughout the week, the second order effect is that it's going to allow you to get better on the mound. It's going to increase your training capacity. So it's just important to think about like not just like the primary cause or the primary effect of something, but what does that allow you to do now? Like what additional affordances does that open up for you?
Couple of quotes that I have written down here from the group. everything we do is general, everything you do is specific. I believe this was Mark Seaver who said this, the strength coach at Wake Forest, meaning that we in the weight room, we are in charge of the general versus you pointing to the audience as pitching coaches, as development staffs. That's where the specifics come in, which I think is a fantastic concept. The general physical preparedness concept is going to come from the weight room. We need to prepare the body there so then you can go work on the sport specific side, which is throwing a ball, swinging a bat, what have you.
I forgot who said it, but they also clear up this misconception that like everything you do in the weight room has to look like your sport. And in
That
fact,
was Chris Martin.
it probably shouldn't look like your sport. It like
Yes.
you should be building general capacities, which then can be used in the actual skill itself, and not these like middle ground exercises that like kind of look like the sport, but they're not actually stable enough to build any actually true capacity or output. But they're also not skill specific enough that you're actually building any skill. And so like people kind of get caught in the middle way too often. As Bryce Kreider also often says, you don't want to get stuck in the middle. And unfortunately, people like in the weight room, they're like, oh, everything I do has to look exactly like the sport. When in reality, that's actually not what's probably best for improving performance.
One thing I did find interesting is with the weight room, the minimum effective dose was encouraged. These guys talked about minimum effective dose and how important that is on their side. Granted, like in season or if you're in pro ball, you probably don't want a lot of energy expenditure unnecessarily to be used in the weight room. I thought it was just kind of an interesting juxtaposition for two presentations prior to hear about not caring at all about the minimum effective dose because we want guys to be exposed to as much work as possible that they can tolerate, to then hear the strength guys say like, nah, find the minimum.
Well,
what do we need and move on?
Well, so if you think about like where these guys are coming from, right? So all of those guys that you just mentioned, the strength and conditioning guys are all dealing with high level athletes who probably have a very high training age. And the weight room is not their lowest hanging fruit. Kanzler with the Cubs was talking about Dominican guys on the skill side, and especially, or even on the physical development side, who are much, much younger and don't have nearly the training age or history with training on either the skill or the weight room side. And so like those different populations probably dictate different types of approaches. Now, a high school guy who comes into Driveline and weighs 140 pounds, like, yeah, we probably shouldn't be doing pitch design on a slider. We should probably be force feeding food down his throat and forcing him to gain muscle mass because that's literally going to be the thing that changes his life more than anything. And so it's really important to know the population that you're working with and like what the low hanging fruit is, what beginner gains are still possible. And if there's not a ton of beginner gains left on the weight room side, you're probably going to get better bang for your buck working on the skill side. And that's, I think, where these guys were coming.
There is probably one more piece that I want to address here, and that is something that I think actually aligns perfectly with something you talked about during our player panel. What is measured versus what is shared. So coaches collect all this data, and then what they collect or what they see on their end doesn't have to be every single thing that goes out. Like, how can we grind on the back end to make what you see as a player actionable? It doesn't need to be simple, but it needs to be actionable.
I mean, I think the quintessential example of this is like an advance report. And if my advance report has all these tables and plots and charts, and when I'm on the mound, I'm thinking like, okay, what was this guy's whiff percentage and two strike counts on sliders below 3 feet in the zone, right? Like I've already lost. Like I'm already thinking about things that I should not be thinking about. What I should be thinking is, I'm throwing a slider here. This is where I'm throwing it. And so actionability requires a little bit of feature engineering and like ability, like cleverness on the back end to like turn things into something actionable. What pitch should I throw? Where should I throw it? That's very actionable, but it requires a lot of actual complex stuff in the back end to make that happen. But I think the same thing is true of your development plan, right? If you want to dig into it, you can. But I think it's really important to know, here's what I need to work on and why, and not necessarily like all the different components that go into it. And so complex on the back end, simple on the front end is kind of what I think is a general rule of thumb that is pretty effective.
I did say one more point, but I actually see a quote that I think could create a little bit of a hot button discussion. So I am going to go back to it and just ask how you interpret it. I wrote this as a quote. It is literally in quotations in my notebook, but I think I paraphrased this a little bit. So I apologize for assigning this to someone. I don't remember exactly who said it, during the panel, but in quotes, I have game of adjustments is a cop out. How do we get back to who you were when things were good? How do you feel about that?
That's interesting without and I actually don't remember the full context of that. But I do think that's something like where these kind of like test retest cycles, like checkpoints in time of knowing like who were you when you were good? Like how did you move? How strong were you? Like what did your shapes look like? I think that's really important. The game of adjustments thing, I think is if you're making your adjustments blindly, I think you've lost, right? Like you're like, I don't know what's going on. I'm way worse than I used to be. And I'm just going to try a bunch of stuff and just see, hopefully something works. It's like this tinkering idea. You see this so often in professional athletes. They're just tinkering on something every day, and every week it's something different. It's like, oh, I think I figured it out this week. It's just my back leg, or oh, it's my glove side, or oh, it's like the way I hold the ball. And you're just never going to be able to make the consistent progress that a guy makes if he knows what he's working towards and he knows why, and he's constantly reevaluating that with objective data. I just don't see a way that's like the other approach is very sustainable at all.
That probably does it on this specific presentation for me. Do you feel there's anything in particular we missed?
No, I think that about covered it. I did like you said, I do wish they would have went into a little bit more of some strength and conditioning topics. Like I think there's a rumor they were going to talk about bench press and stuff like that, but they never got into it. But yeah, I think overall it was a lot of great minds on there, and it was nice to hear from them.
Okay, so that puts a bow on the S&C panel. And then, although this wasn't our original intention at the start of the episode, Josh and I did hit a little pause recording button there to discuss a plan. If anyone is keeping track at home, we're about an hour and a half into this already, and we are exactly halfway through the Wake Forest Player Development Seminar. And at the mercy of our significant others or any other priorities that we have waiting for us on the other side of this recording, we decided to press pause and we will reconvene with a part two. This is going to be the first part one and part two layback episode that I have ever done. And if I'm not mistaken, that will quickly put Hejka in the lead of total layback podcast appearances. So maybe this
It's
was
like the Brooklyn Cyclones all over again.
Yeah.
All-time appearances record holder.
That was a conversation topic on our first episode.
It probably was.
So yeah, we'll tie things off here. No sense doing any crazy reviews at the end. We are going to pick things up post lunch on Saturday. That'll be Chase Aldridge, next base, NBA trends from the
Daniel
New York
Kurtzer.
Knicks. MLB panel. After the MLB panel, we get into winning with workload with Casey Mulholland, the precision model with Nick Serio, and then performance neurology with IHT, and then maybe some final takeaways from the weekend. So that's
we got some good ones. We got some really good ones for next episodes. This episode, there's some really good discussion, and excited to talk about some of these other ones in the next episode. It'll be a good time.
Yeah, well, Josh, thanks for dedicating this much time for just a part one. Looking forward to another hour and a half or so on part two.
Let's do it. Yeah, this was great.
We'll find a way. And to everyone out there, thanks for laying back with us.